So we're ready now to lift off the plastic, reveal and see what's happened. And there you go. We've got all our lovely interesting patterns of showing the veins in the bee's wings. And yeah, that's quite an interesting and exciting effect. And every time you do this, you'll get something different. Sometimes it will work better than others. You don't want the paint too wet when you're applying the plastic on top. If it's slightly thicker, you'll get perhaps even more finer patterns and textures showing up. But yeah, so you can see how it quite nicely creates those scents of veins and that delicate sort of translucent texture of the wings. So now for painting the bee's body, and I'm going to go in with my red tail first. And even though the tail is red, there's sort of an orangey glow to it. And generally whenever painting anything that's red, I sort of start with a yellow base wash. So I'm just using my yellow and flicking that on just to give a base, because it just gives that extra luminosity and glow to the red. And also the more slightly different subtle colours you add, the more depth and fluffiness you'll get, more texture to the fur, because the bumblebees are very furry. And in order to create that sense of the fur, the hairs, I'm just using an old sort of coarse painting brush. So for this, the older your paintbrush is, the better, and the stiffer really, because you can flick and get quite a lot of nice fine texture in there. You can use just the very tip of the paintbrush as well. If I go in with my red, I can just flick out, doing lots of little brush strokes. And the amount of detail you add really depends how detailed you want your drawing to be. You can get long if you're using watercolours or any water-based paint. You can get little fine, this is a liner brush, or you can get a slightly longer rigger brush, which is really good just for flicking out. And try and make the hairs, try not paint them in too regular a pattern. Really get that naturalistic effect just by flicking out with the paint. I'm trying to get that fairly dry paint, just flicking it out, giving the bee that furry texture. And building up the layers of colour. If you want to make your red darker, you can add with the complementary colour to red, so the colour opposite on the colour wheel. So we could add in a little bit of green. So mix our blue and yellow together and add a little bit of that green colour into the red, and that will give us a slightly darker shade again. And what you can also do, if you feel it's gone, so we can mix a green here and then add that green colour into our red, and it will just darken it slightly. If you add a lot of the complementary colour, you'll find you end up with more of a brown. So it's just adding a little bit at a time and seeing what happens. But it is good, rather than just doing one shade of red, to add in quite a few different shades, because as I say, it gives more depth and texture to your painting. And what you can do is also use the end of your paintbrush and scratch out, and that can work well for giving some of the sort of lighter hairs and a little bit of that hairy texture. Monty's been enjoying doing this today, just sort of scratching into the paint, creating different patterns. So for my black areas, my darker colour, I'm going to just mix in a little bit of all my primary colours together. If you mix them in equal proportions, the red, blue and yellow, you get a good black shade. I've got a little bit more red here, which is giving me a slight purpley black, because when you actually look at the bee's fur and any black creature, it's not just pure black, there's lots of sort of purples in there, or blue blacks, brownish blacks. So it's good to get some of those different shades within your bee's body, in the thorax and the abdomen. So just sort of dabbing on initially, getting some of those different colours and trying to create that texture. You can get brushes called a fan brush, and you can, even if you've got a really old paintbrush, sort of cut it to create a little fan brush. The nice thing with the fan brush is you can very quickly paint in hairs. Because of that fan shape, it gives a lot of texture, and you quickly get all the individual hairs, because they're quite spread out. You get very distinctive, very visible. Just show you on the back, you get quite nice visible bristle marks. So we can also use that to give that help, and it's good for particularly around the edges of the bee's fur, just flicking out around his body and the head to give that fuzzy furry edge, because you don't want a smooth edge to your bee, you want to capture that fuzzy hairy body. The other thing that can work quite nicely is using a toothbrush, and actually that can work really well for just flicking out again and sort of scrubbing it along almost, can very effectively give a good furry body. So all in between the wings, you often, where the wings join onto the body, you sort of get these whorls of fur. So again, we could use our back of our paintbrush to just draw in, and actually you can use that quite nicely to flick out and drag the paint, and that can very effectively give that furry texture, because you don't want it all just to be a solid black, because that would look very flat. You particularly round the side of the body, perhaps the base as it curves under the bee, you can mix a darker shade of colour in order to give that sense of volume, to get some nice darker shadows. And so we can gradually build up those textures. Having the paint quite concentrated to give those darker tones. And then we'll just carry on with this technique of scraping out to indicate that furry body. But having our hairs coming across in different directions and sort of flicking out and following the curve of the bee's body there. So and for the legs as well, they're quite hairy. So say you have particularly long hairs around the pollen basket as well. So when we get to painting the bee's legs, I'll use a smaller brush and mix a brown. So I can mix a brown by adding my yellow and red, which will give a nice orange, and then adding a complementary colour and just a little bit of blue, and that will give me a good brown colour, which I can use to paint the segments on the bee's legs. And I could even take some of my yellow and dab it onto the pollen sac. And pollen comes in all different colours. It's really fascinating when you look at bees. Actually, some of them have pink on their pollen sacs, and some flowers with pink pollen. Some have bright orange, some obviously classic yellow, and some are really dark, sort of blackish colours. And actually people, honeybees, beekeepers can tell what flowers their bees been feeding on just by looking at the different colours of the pollen. And to get some texture to the segments on the bee's legs, you can sponge up and down just using the side of your brush. And we can use that technique for the bee's eyes as well. I'm going to use sort of maybe a kind of bluish grey, just using a blue with a little tiny bit of yellow and black, and just sponge up and down. And that will help to indicate all those different lenses in the bee's compound eyes. So it just helps to give the texture of the bee's eyes. And again, you can almost just scratch out or lift off with a little clean brush or your finger to give a highlight or a few highlights. Fingers are also really good for dabbing up and down to give the sense of the light catching on the bee's eye. And their antennae are a sort of blackish, usually a blackish brown. So we can go up, and they're all segmented as well. So we could go up one side of the antennae with a lighter brown colour. And then we can go along the other edge with our slightly darker black-brown, just to help to give it that three-dimensional appearance. And again, we can use the end of the brush and just scrape out some little segments to get the sense of all the segments on the bee's antennae. So we just add in a few more little details, like some of I'll stipple on the legs now with a slightly darker colour. Again, on one side where I want a little bit more shadow, and that will help to give them that three-dimensional appearance. And then our bee will nearly be finished. We'll have our red-tailed bumblebee. And it's fun to actually try and depict. I'm in the process of trying to paint all the British bumblebees, and it's a great thing to do in the solitary bees as well. They're slightly different because they're generally often less hairy, but you get really interesting patterns and lovely bright colours as well. But of course, these techniques can be applied to lots of different insects, or you could just have fun making up your own imaginary bee as well. And if you want to find out more information about bumblebees and how you can help them, and also ID guides for identifying them, which you can download, and lots of different bee activities, you can go to the Bumblebee Conservation Trust website. And Friends of the Earth as well also have some lovely information about bees and sort of bee-friendly planting for the garden, because that can make a huge difference. The type of plants you have in the garden can really attract the bees, getting those right plants like borage and dandelions, nasturtiums, lots of beautiful open flowers, poppies, and then you'll have plenty of bees to photograph and paint in your own garden. So I'm just following round the edge of the wings, adding in a few slightly darker shades, and then just using the end of my brush to get that hairy texture. As I say, it's good to do lots of studies of the bees and try different techniques. So this is using that scraping out technique, but you could also do another one just using the toothbrush, or another study with sort of an old paintbrush flicking, or just your very small paintbrush doing lots and lots of fleckles. Put some music on with a good rhythm, and you can actually quite quickly paint all those little fine hairs. And it's quite good to put some shadow in at the top of the legs where they join into the body. So you get a little bit of a darker shadow there, giving some depth. And they've got actually another leg coming in here, as they've got 6 legs like all insects, 3 on each side. Slightly smaller legs at the front, and the back legs are longer with these pollen sacs. The second pair of legs sort of have a comb on them that comb the pollen off the front legs, and then they sort of transfer them into the pollen baskets on the back legs. And it's good to learn a little bit more about the anatomy of any subject you're painting, because then it really helps when you come to paint it to know what you're drawing and looking at. So you can just flick out, getting these larger hairs, and it's quite good to get hairs just actually dragging out. You don't need too much paint on the brush. You can get quite fine hair effects just by dragging the paint out and flicking it, and that can give some really good sort of hairy, furry textures. And as can, sort of sponging up and down and flicking out with the brush. So there you go, there's our red-tailed bumblebee in paint and using the old plastic bits of wrapping to create that texture of the wings. So have a go and have fun and enjoy experimenting with different techniques for creating the furry texture of the bees' bodies as well. They're great subjects to paint.